Greetings, everyone. You're all muted right now. We'll unmute. No, somebody's not unmuted. A friend of mine is laughing. So we'll unmute after Jeff Pollock has said his. There he is now. After Jeff has given his little introductory remarks, and then I'll start off the questions with a couple, and then we'll open it up. And I'm hoping that a bunch of you have questions and are willing to ask. No grand statement is necessary. All we need is the question. Hi, Jeff, and we'll go from there. So it's 5:01. Let's give a couple more minutes for some more sign-ins, and then we'll begin. I'm looking forward to tonight, the culmination of something here. I'm not sure what that something is. I hope you've gotten something out of this, and that I haven't offended anyone too much. I've tried to be fair. I think I am. I'm a centrist. I believe you need balanced government. I think you need both parties. We haven't had both parties working together for a while. I think we can get back there. And even though I've maybe been a little gloomy of late, I'm still a half glass full guy. I think we'll get out of this. And I think we'll have two functioning parties, which we desperately need. We need balance. We need to hear both sides in a legitimate way. So I've blathered on enough. So I think we'll start, because I want to give Jeff lots of time here. All right, I got to get some. I'm struggling to find my, how do I close this? Something's in the way. Why is it in the way? Oh, okay, I moved it. Give me a second here. Got to get all my ducks in a row. Okay. So I just want to summarize where have we been for the last 4 weeks before we kick off, what's happening today. The U.S. Constitution established a democratic republic that has served us well, and I expect will continue to serve us well. Leaders at all levels of government must practice civic virtue in order to lead effectively. The checks and balance system is a necessary element. They're co-equal branches. If you read the Constitution carefully, the Congress and the executive work together, but they both have checks on each other. And as I've said over the years, and I didn't get into too much of this, but the Congress has given in to the presidency, both parties, over time. And it's time to get back to Congress doing what it's supposed to do. Whether or not they're willing to, I don't know. But I think it's a necessary thing. The fear of mobocracy was a key element in most of the framers' minds. And, we have a taste of that now. Partisan tribalism, lying, conspiracy theories, violence, and terrorism have been prevalent throughout much of our nation's political history. I think we've had a naive attitude towards our Constitution and how wonderful it is. And it is wonderful, but it's not perfect, nor will it ever be perfect. With civic virtue breaking down, with the checks and balance system breaking down, there is an increase of seeing all the weaknesses that are there. And it's up to leadership to make the Constitution work the way it's supposed to work. And it can. Go away. High voter turnout often coincides with periods of deadlock and hyperpartisanship. Not always, but more times than not, it does. So those are my main points. Those are what I've tried to show throughout our history from the 1750s on. And to what degree does history repeat itself? It's why I gave you those historians' theories about history and how we see it. Their theories, none of them are written concrete. They're just ideas. So here's some recent voter turnout percentages. We looked at the older ones in the last class. 1932, Depression, FDR election, 52% participation. 1952, after World War II, Eisenhower is the candidate, it's 61%, a little higher. 1960, which is always the bellwether state or election we talk about, it's the highest it's ever been, or highest it's been in a long, long time. And oftentimes that's what people talk about, the 60 election. It's not even 63%. And of course, looking at the other votes, you know that we've had higher turnouts than that, 80%. 76, Nixon in his second term, 53%. And then after that, it drops continuously, 96, 49. Then it picks up in 2016, 54.8. And of course, this last election, 62. So it's on the rise. So is that part of this whole point? Voter turnout increases, and so does political violence, hyperpartisanship, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to see what happens in the midterms and 24 before we'll see what happens. One of my favorite commentators, authors of current things is John Meacham. I think he's thoughtful. He actually was a Republican for a long, long time from Tennessee. And he has said there's three characteristics for citizens and leaders. Curiosity, the huh moment. Humility, learn from mistakes. Empathy, see the world through other people's eyes. And he feels that, you know, a president today and the senators and congressmen and women should all have these, as well as, you know, lower level politicians. Two quotes. Ultimately, we as a people have to allow leaders to make important compromises. It's the work of citizenship. Will we continue to pursue a perfect union, or will we settle into a struggle of tribal warfare with our worst instincts? Dark forces are perennial, but so are forces of light. So the cultural battles of the Civil War were won, even though weren't won, even though military battles were. And I leave you with this contemporary cartoon, which I think is so appropriate. Okay, folks, today we're going to reenact a school board meeting. And my class comes to an end. Can we return to some level of normalcy? And we'll see what Jeffrey Pollack has to say. So Jeffrey Pollack, class of 1989. Yeah, the yearbook says it best. Lord. I wasn't going to show you these pictures until I could pop them on you. Out of the yearbook. Thank you, Heather, for finding these. A lively liberal, senior Jeffrey Pollack is active in politics, both in and out of school. Jeff campaigned for Dukakis in the 1988 election. Oh boy. And is the president of the Young Democrats. And of course, this is out of GA. And of course, he was working on the yearbook, such a young, fresh face, hasn't changed a bit. And Jeffrey, of course, is an illustrious alumni, as all our alumni are. Jeffrey is the founding partner and president of Global Strategy Group. And here's just a few things. Jeff's current clients include 4 governors from Delaware, New York, Maine, and Illinois, 4 U.S. senators, Massachusetts, Nevada, New York, West Virginia, and numerous congressional representatives, and 3 national Democratic organizations. But he doesn't just do politics. He's conducted research for the Major League Baseball, Everytown for Gun Safety, Comcast, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Harvard University, AFSCME, Ford Motor, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, University of Pennsylvania, his college, and MGM Resorts. Maybe he's staying there tonight. He's, by the way, in Vegas. He's made numerous TV appearances that you see whenever key elections are coming up. But the most important thing he has ever done is appear in 2 major motion pictures, The Place Beyond the Pines and Nonstop. That one I don't know. So without further ado, let's hear from Jeff.
Yeah, that Place Beyond the Pine movie had some other GA alum that maybe people have heard of that's a little more famous than I am. But you know, I'm better looking than Bradley, right? So thanks so much, Kendall, for having me. It's great to be here. And always, whenever Kendall asks, the answer is yes. I appreciate all the nice things, but I do what I do for a living, and I do what I do every day because of Kendall Natter, because of what he did to inspire me to love politics and realize I can make money from it. I'm not sure he ever knew that that's where he was guiding me. But that's something I was passionate about, as you can see, at a relatively young age, that I could take on as a profession. And I really do owe that to him. I am also pleased to see any number of my former teachers, Mr. House, Dr. Drew, I can see, Ms. Hoffman, who just joined. So very, very nice to see all of you. And I may have missed one or two, but great to be here. So, you know, Kendall and I talked a little bit about what we would discuss tonight, and I'm gonna riff off of what he just said, and then he's got some questions that he's gonna ask me, and then we'll open it up. But the big thing is this notion, and I've been watching the classes as well, this notion that the sort of chaos that happened on January 6th is less unique than I think we all suspect. I think we looked at January 6th, most of us, given the real peace in DC, I mean peace from a violence perspective, for all of our lives that are on this call. But the reality is, if you look at history, it's not that unusual, and the tumult is very real. And the things that happened on January 6th are born out of frustration. They are born out of frustration with the politics of Washington. They're born out of frustration with economic malaise and a feeling of being left out. They are born out of very real emotions, but they are also born out of a very terrifying demagogue in Donald Trump. One thing, I'm a Democrat, obviously, as you saw in my little bio from the yearbook. I was the head of the Young Democrats. To be clear, there were no Young Democrats. It didn't exist at Germantown Academy when I was there.
It did.
I was the founder, creator, and I'm pretty sure I did it largely to try to hit on a couple of young ladies. But you know, it worked out. I'm very happy that I did that. So I'm a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat. My entire life. And today I only work for Democrats. I have a different, and so I'm partisan, and it's very hard for me to play down the middle. I'll try a little bit today, but the one person I can't play down the middle for is Donald Trump, because I believe that what he has done in terms of the harm that he has done, that I think is irreparable to institutions, to faith in institutions, to trust in government, and his continual fomenting of the big lie. These are things that I find unforgivable, not partisan, unforgivable. So I'm in Vegas, as Kendall said. I'm in Las Vegas right now with the American Association of Political Consultants. So a whole bunch of people who look like me are here in Vegas. If a bomb blew up, nobody would notice. Campaigns would still go on. But it's an amazing place because, and I've been on the board of this organization for 15 years. Republicans and Democrats, we talk all the time. We talk and we work together and we do things together. And it is virtually universal how upset and difficult many of my Republican colleagues feel about Donald Trump and what he has done. And they're in charge of doing campaigns whereby they have to appeal to those very, very Trumpy voters. And they have to do things that I think from a political consulting perspective, make them uncomfortable. It's our job to win the election. So, they have to do what they have to do. But the despair that I hear in their voice over kind of the politics and what Trump has done, and January 6th in particular, is remarkable. It's universal to some extent. And I'm kind of glad about that. I mean, I like the notion that we can have these conversations on both sides and say, like, we need to fix stuff. I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic as Kendall that we're going to fix things. I think the politics are so broken in some ways that the far left and the far right, and trust me, I have just as many problems with the far left as I do the far right, the politics of primaries and the way we elect people, whereby the most left person or the most right-wing person wins a primary, and then we are given a choice between the two extremes, feels like an incredibly broken system. The fact that today we had a vote in the United States Senate that failed on party line vote, that we could not get people to agree. And this is Joe. And so I work for Joe Manchin. I work for whatever conservative Democrats are left in this country. I work for a bunch of them. So I work for Joe Manchin, which doesn't make me a lot of friends on the left. And he worked very hard with Republicans to get the bill today, the voting rights bill, to a place where he thought Republicans could actually vote for it, and not one. That's the kind of thing that says to me, Kendall, I'm not sure where we're going to go with our politics. And the reason that we can't get and I'm not actually being critical of the Republicans here, the reason that they are fearful of signing on to such legislation is they're just going to get primaried. And somebody's going to run at them from the right. And so they are doing it from a self-preservation perspective, which is what politicians do. Politicians are narcissistic human beings. They are fundamentally narcissists because just in terms of the kind of people who run for office, they're people who expose their lives to the public. And so you have to be a narcissist to do that. They are all about self-preservation. And the ones who have done the right thing, whether it's a Liz Cheney or an Adam Kinzinger or a Mitt Romney, it's done nothing but give them headaches. So what's the incentive? So I think we need a lot of changes, some wholesale changes. For me, I would advocate for the elimination of party primaries and have everybody run at once and top two people win. That's the California system. That's one way to do it. There are multiple ways to do it, but that is one thing that I would love to see eliminated is partisan primaries. That's not good for me. It's party primaries are fine for me, so I'm not doing it for a business reason. I just think that's the only way we can begin to get back to the middle and begin to tone down the conversation. And I hope very much that Donald Trump does not run. I may disagree vehemently with Ron DeSantis and others on the Republican side who would run if Trump was not running. I would take any one of those people over Donald Trump because they generally function within the confines of political norms, and that's what we need. The fact that we have had to depend, though, on politicians to do the right thing is the flaw of the democracy and the flaw of our fundamentally weak Constitution that we all love, but is incredibly flawed. And the framers had a notion that we were going to have statesmen as leaders. There's not a lot of statesmanship going on right now. So, you know, that's my downer note. So Kendall, ask some questions. That was my blathering about January 6th and where we go. But I'll toss it back to you for some questions.
Okay, easy one first. So you're with your fellow Republicans and Democrats, and you say you have a lot in common. Are there different polling techniques between the Republicans and the Democrats?
Yeah. So the answer is no. And that's a good thing, because polling is supposed to be quasi-scientific. It's based in science, based in statistics. The reality is Republican and Democratic polls look and are done almost the same way. One of the reasons that I'm here today, I presented on a panel where we talked about the flaws of 2020 polling and what went wrong and what we're going to do. And I gave my presentation and the Republican pollster gave her presentation, and our slides were identical in some ways. You could have taken either one of us. And so we do things the same way. I'm sure we ask some questions differently, but by and large, it's identical. The other thing that people ask is, well, why do you only work for Democrats? That seems weird. I only work for Democrats. Republicans only work for Republicans. Why couldn't I work for everybody? Well, I could, but I wouldn't have any business. I work for Democrats because obviously I want to elect Democrats. I believe that it's better to elect a Democrat than a Republican, just writ large. I work for lots of flavors of Democrats, which makes me a little unusual. As I said, I work for these conservative Democrats like a Joe Manchin. I also work for the most progressive senator in the United States Senate, or two of them, Ed Markey and Kirsten Gillibrand. So I can work for a very conservative Democrat in a place like West Virginia, a very liberal Democrat in a place like Massachusetts and New York, because those people represent their states. They can get elected in those states. But I only work for Democrats and Democratic constituencies, and my Republican friends only work for Republicans. Our job is to try to get as many of our folks elected as possible so that we control the Senate, we control the House, we control the presidency, and we control the levers of government. And so that is the reason we only work on one side or the other.
Thank you. Okay, here's a tougher one.
Mm-hmm.
Polls in 2020 had Democrats performing much better than the actual outcome. Does your profession have a Trump problem?
We do indeed. We have a major Trump problem. And the question is, what does that mean for us this cycle, meaning when I say cycle, this 2022 midterm election? We're nervous. So let me tell you a little bit about what happened in 2020 with polling. So I'm going to give you a little bit of what I did today, frankly. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. All right. So you should be seeing a lovely picture of Vegas.
Not yet. Oh, no. Yes.
Okay. All right. So in 2020, there's two sets of data here. On the left side of this chart, in the presidential battleground states, polling was off by about 1.8% on average. If you look at 538, the public polling, polls were off by about 1.8%. In our private polling for my company, in those same battlegrounds, we were off by about 1.4%. So we were a little better than public polls, but still we were overestimating the Democratic share by at least a point to a point and a half. In the Senate battlegrounds, the numbers are far worse. The public polls overestimated how Democrats would do by close to 3.5%. And in my private polling, we overestimated how the Democrat would do by about 2.5%. Why? There's two reasons for it. The main cause of error is something called non-response bias. The people who responded to polls were attitudinally different than the people who did not respond to polls in ways that we couldn't account for. What does all that nonsense mean? And Kendall, I know, sent around the Medium post that I did that talks a little bit about this. It means, in the most simplistic way, there are some people who didn't want to talk to us. And in the past, there have always been people who talk to us in polling and don't talk to us in polling. But if I talked to 100 Republicans and I got a good cross section of Republicans, those 100 Republicans were representative of Republicans in general. Because of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump said, don't trust the polls, don't trust the media, don't trust the academics, don't trust the institutions, a portion of the population did not talk to us. Not only me, Republican pollsters, same exact thing. Didn't talk to us, didn't talk to the public pollsters. They sat out any kind of conversation about the election. And so this is a real problem, because if you're not talking to them and the other people that you are talking to are not representative, then we have functionally missed a chunk of the electorate. The easiest oversimplification of this, and I know that it's way oversimplified, is the Republicans I talked to were Republicans who believe in science and believe in that masks are important. And the ones that I didn't talk to are ones who don't believe in science, who don't think that they should wear masks, or think that it's a hoax, or think that the election's a fraud. So the first group of Republicans that I said that we spoke to were no longer representative of all Republicans. If we don't get those people to talk to us, we are overestimating the Democrat in each one of those scenarios, underestimating the Republican. The second thing that happened, though, is turnout error. This is much harder for pollsters to deal with, because all the work that we do is based on what happened in the past. We are modeling things based on past elections, because previous elections are the best predictors of future. Unlike your Merrill Lynch portfolio, where your financial advisor says past performance is not predictive of future. Well, in voting, it is very predictive. Something happened in 2020 that was remarkably different, which is Democratic turnout went up to an incredible number, epically high, and Republican turnout went up even higher. And the people who came out to vote on the Republican side in particular, that increase, so I said the Democrats were here, the Republicans were here. So there's a chunk of vote that were low propensity Republican voters, meaning people who don't normally vote. They don't normally vote in presidentials. They don't normally vote at all. They came out to vote, and they were unbelievably Trumpy. And that is very hard for us to deal with. So let me just show you an example of how you would deal with this. This is data from 10 different states: Alaska, Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Maine, Michigan, Montana, North Carolina, Wisconsin. So there were 10 battleground states where there were Senate races going on, presidential Senate race going on in 2020. If you took the last polls that we did, smushed them all together, Biden was winning 52.4 to 47.6 according to the polling. And that's weighted to pre-election model. What does that mean? It means that if we thought that the electorate was going to be 53% female, that we weighted the data, or made sure the data was 53% female. If we thought it was going to be 35% Republican, the data was 35% Republican. So that gave us a 52.4 to 47.6. Then a month or two after the election, we weighted the data to actual turnout. Because what if there weren't 53% female? What if it was 55 or 57 or 49, whatever the number is? So we weight to actual turnout. And in theory, if the data is good, once you've weighted to actual turnout, because we know how many young people, how many old people, how many white, black, et cetera, we know that data. So if we weight to actual turnout, it should theoretically be pretty close to the real result. So we weighted it, and now it's 51.5 to 48.5. Then we weighted it to actual turnout, and we looked at a question that we asked in the polls: who did you vote for in 2016, Trump or Hillary Clinton? And so we weighted the data to what actually happened in 2016 in those states. Now it's 51.2 to 48.8. We then weighted it again and put attitudinal variables on things, meaning trying to find questions that would allow us to increase the number of very conservative or very Trumpy people. So questions about racial resentment, for example, questions that are more attitudinal, that allow people to sort of explore and talk about how they feel, that would show their very conservative leanings. And you do that, and now we're at 50.9 to 49.1. So just look at how it's narrowing each and every step that we've done. But the actual election day results in those 10 states is 49.7 for Biden, 50.3 for Trump. So there are still missing people, even though we did all this stuff. So the answer, Kendall, with all that is we do have a Trump problem. We have a Trump problem in that when Trump was on the ballot, he brought out all of these voters, low propensity voters in particular on the Republican side, and they didn't speak to us. So the question is, what's going to happen in 2022? And I don't know. I don't know whether they'll come out. I don't know. In 2018, they didn't, and the Democrats had a great year. In 2022, will they? I don't know. Democrats don't seem that motivated right now. We're looking at a Virginia governor's race where if you sort of gun to my head right now, I actually think the Democrat loses, which the polls right now are tied. But just when I think about how things are moving and how things are going on, it doesn't feel very good for my side in Virginia. So that would indicate low enthusiasm on the Democratic side, low enthusiasm for the Democrats. And the fact that that the president and Congress on the Democratic side can't seem to get their heads out of their butts to pass something makes that even more likely that sort of Democratic enthusiasm is depressed. But it is still a very big don't know. We're in the middle of a massive project right now with 5 other Democratic polling firms where we are trying to figure out how can we find those very conservative Trumpy voters and get them to talk to us. We're using methodologies that go back 50 plus years. We're doing door-to-door interviews. We are sending surveys in the mail with money in them to incentivize people to do the survey. We are mailing people surveys. We're doing online, text, everything that we can. But like door-to-door, face-to-face interviews is the single most expensive way that we could do stuff. But we want to see what has to be done to try to figure out how to get those folks to talk to us. And we're then asking lots of questions about those attitudinal variables I talked about. Racial resentment being one, but another one, which is an interesting one, those very Trumpy folks who didn't talk to us are much more likely to believe in corporal punishment. I'm not here to pass judgment on what people think, but that's interesting. They are much more likely to believe in corporal punishment. Therefore, if I asked a question about corporal punishment in my survey and I was able to increase the number of people who are for corporal punishment, that theoretically would help me fix the problem that I'm having. So long answer to yes, we have a huge Trump problem.
Very interesting. I think I followed you. No, it was good. I have other questions, but I said this was an open discussion. So I think at this point, I'm hoping there are people ready and willing to ask a question.
Please.
I have
Matthew, is that you?
Oh yeah. I probably like Kendall, I could ask questions for the entire hour. So feel free to shut me up or cut me off.
Oh, we will. Don't worry, Matt.
Oh yeah. I meant Jeff. I know you will. So for one of the approaches for sort of correcting for these biases in the sort of likely voter models has been to not quite measure likelihood of voting, measure enthusiasm for voting. So like the LA Times has had some success with that. I was wondering if you've tried that or if there's a way to incorporate that with some of the other techniques that you mentioned to kind of better put your finger on the pulse, because enthusiasm is something that's contagious. It'll bleed through social networks. So even if you're not talking to the people you need to talk to, if you're talking to the people that they rah about too on Facebook or in the neighborhood, you may be able to sort of capture more of that.
Yep. So we have not found a consistent voter enthusiasm question that has been predictive of turnout. And in fact, even worse, we found 2 different questions, how excited are you to vote versus like how interested are you in the elections, like just as 2 enthusiasm questions. One of them worked in one state, one of them worked in another state. We hate it when that happens, right? Because there's the lack of consistency. So at least at this point, no. It's very hard because we're still calling you up or sending you a survey and asking you to tell us your self-described likelihood to vote. And every single person is much more likely to over-report their likelihood of voting, not under-report, because it is still seen as a social good. So until we get surveys that allow us to get to brainwaves where we don't have to ask people questions, but we can just see what their brain is thinking. We think enthusiasm is still a hard question for us to use, and not the panacea that I would like it to be.
Would you ever try and get at that sort of social factor more directly, like asking in a survey, like what % of your neighbors do you think would vote the way you do? Or
yeah, we do, but again, it's not gonna fix this problem that we have. It wouldn't fix the fact that people aren't talking to us.
It's just too clustered.
Thanks, Matt. Mr. House.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Hola.
Good. Are all polling firms either democratically leaning or Republican leaning? Is that true for, say, the Marist poll or the Pew polls? They all have a bias.
They do not.
Oh, they don't.
They do not. So Mr. House was both my middle school dean and my Spanish teacher. So gracias por todo, como siempre, Mr. House. So the answer to the question is no. Those pollsters that you're talking about, Marist, Quinnipiac, the public pollsters, are not partisan.
Okay.
At all. And I actually don't think that they have a partisan bent. Like, I don't think that when you look at them, that one of them is sort of leans more Democratic. They're not. The partisan pollsters are partisan and only work, right? But we're working for a candidate. Marist never works for Joe Blow for Congress. Marist only works for either they publish polls for themselves or they publish for a newspaper or some type of news agency, but they are nonpartisan. The interesting thing about some of those places, Marist, Quinnipiac, Monmouth, these are places that have put themselves on the map of the college scene by doing polling. 20 years ago, people hadn't heard of Marist. And 5 years ago, nobody had heard of Monmouth. And it's been a very clever way for them to increase brand. And they use students, most of them, to do their calls. Marist has a whole public opinion center where they train kids, and I hire a bunch of people from there. So they are nonpartisan.
Thank you.
Of course.
Can I catch in?
Ms. Hoffman, please.
Yes, Tevye, so good to see you.
Hi, Jenny.
So I'm curious how much you think polling, I think, sometimes affects the voter turnout, in the sense that I see polls and then I'm thinking, well, we're ahead by a landslide, so it doesn't matter if I vote because things are under control. Or you get the other factor, which I think might have been the Trumpian people, that, hey, you're saying he's going to lose. Well, we're all going to get out there and prove you wrong because we hate you pollsters because you're all, telling us what we believe. How much of an impact do you think that has in an election?
Yeah. So I generally think that it does have more of a depressing effect than it has a motivating effect, although Trump may have been different, right? Those voters may be unique, but in a normal election where Trump isn't a factor, you see a blowout poll, why would you come out to vote? So I hate those polls. I hate them. I think they serve no purpose. But I also can't stop them from going on. There's no question that we hear from people, I don't need to vote because I've seen 10 polls that show me that the election is a fait accompli. Let's look at a great example this year of the other thing that happened. California, they're doing a recall election of Gavin Newsom. The recall gets on the ballot. A poll comes out, 2 polls come out that show the recall actually getting close. And all of a sudden it did motivate people, and they ran a real campaign. The numbers changed. They ran on COVID. And so actually polling there helped them. It helped to motivate people to come out to vote. And they were happy about it. I actually don't believe that it was ever that close, but the public poll said it, and they were like, great. Because I don't think they ever believed it. But yes, there's no question, Ms. Hoffman, that it can drive both up and down turnout.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could I ask a question? Can you hear me?
I can. Yes, sir. Eric.
Yeah, it seems to me that I may be wrong, but in Europe, certain European countries, they prohibit polling.
Correct.
Several days before the election.
Even more, even for the last month, many of them.
Yeah. And I wondered to what extent you would be in favor of limiting polling in an effort not to influence the results.
I would be all for it. So one of the things, and I don't think it's doable because of our free speech protections, but if you, whenever you see so my polls that I do for candidates, you will almost never see in the public domain, because the goal of our polls is to guide a campaign as to what they should be saying. What's the message? What should they be talking about? So the private campaign polls largely aren't out there. When you see them, they are out there for one and only one reason: raising money, right? Campaign puts a poll out to say, hey, I'm in the fight, or hey, I'm behind, I need your money. That's the only reason why you might see private campaign polls out there. But if I had my druthers, I would want no public polls, because they do nothing but give all of us headaches. But I don't see it happening, Eric. Thank you.
Jeff, I have a question. Can we change the subject for a second and talk about something else you said?
Anything you want, Jeffrey.
So you mentioned that we have a statesmanship problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, but I think back to when Richard Nixon was forced to resign for fear of impeachment, which was obviously driven by the fact that he was guilty of sin, but also driven by the fact that he lost the support of Republicans in the Senate and knew that he would be impeached. And some have argued, I hate that expression, but I just used it. But some have argued that if the media climate that we have today existed back then, perhaps he wouldn't have resigned, because he wouldn't have felt like
he definitely wouldn't have resigned.
I'm sorry?
He definitely would not
Definitely wouldn't have resigned, right? So the question is, fundamentally, do what we have is truly a statesmanship problem, or do we have a media problem?
I think we have
And
both.
given the fact that people are fundamentally the same, and they've
Yeah.
been so since the Constitution was founded, that's the reason why we still have the same Constitution.
Yes. If Jeffrey, if I could get rid of something else, I would get rid of MSNBC and Fox News, both. I don't watch any of the nonsense on either side. They're both noise and do nothing for democracy. There's no question that the media environment is one that has contributed dramatically to this. Again, I ask, how do we change it? What is the thing that we could do to change it? And so it requires, it does require Republicans standing up to Donald Trump, Democrats standing up to the left, and not being afraid of their own shadow and not being self-preservationists. I do think that politicians have become worse about that. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe Kendall will disagree with me. But back in the day when, who was it? Washington wouldn't, no, Madison lost the election because he wouldn't buy people booze on election day, right? So there were standards and morals. I do think the fact that we don't have them is problematic, and even like Lamar Alexander, who's a great Republican, great statesman, he did not do the right thing against Donald Trump, and I expected him to. Mitt Romney is really the one shining example of somebody who stood up and said this is wrong. And why did he do it? He did it because, frankly, the LDS community is very uncomfortable with Donald Trump. And so even though he knew it wasn't necessarily good for him, he had the backing of so many Mormons in his community telling him, like, you got to stand up and do what's right. But he still could easily lose a primary tomorrow, particularly in Utah, where they don't actually have primaries. They have conventions where the craziest people on either side win. So I didn't answer any question, Jeff. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I do blame the media.
I think if I could just editorialize based on my broad swath of knowledge of history, I would argue that one of the things we've seen with COVID, for example, is that the public really isn't good about weighting intelligently a variety of sources of information. And that's true. That's true even more so in politics, where people's lives don't necessarily depend on the outcome. And it gets back to this fundamental question that Kendall's talked about throughout the course about, how good is even the idea of democracy, right? Like participatory democracy, not just representative democracy by intelligent, civic-minded people, but representative democracy. And I don't know that there's ever been a golden age of representative democracy where the public was really well-informed and doing the right thing, but it seems like it could only be harder in this era of just a plethora of untrusted sources.
Correct. All correct. Yes,
Jeffrey. Greg Sampson, class
Yes,
of
sir.
79. And by way of introduction, the Germantown Academy Ski Club would not have been started in my time there without at least a small desire to meet girls that way. So, you know, we all have motivations, and call it at 61. I feel free sharing that at this point. But I have to admit, I'm intrigued by your statement, and I would love to hear you elaborate a little bit more on doing away with primaries. I think I heard it right. That are specific to parties would go a long way. Would you care to spend a minute or two on that?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, look, if you gave me a magic wand to change a couple of things in the country that I think would improve our elections, the first thing that I would do is I would eliminate partisan gerrymandering. And I mean for everybody. The way that the Pennsylvania map is drawn it's criminal. It is criminal. The way that the New Yorkers are about to draw the maps against Republicans and in Illinois is criminal. So that's not partisan. If we had competitive elections in every district, or in many districts, obviously you're gonna have some that are not competitive, but if you had many more and you had nonpartisan redistricting, I think it would go a long way to fixing part of our problem, which is this creation of which is this sort of push to the extremes. So the second thing is the partisan primaries, where all Republicans run on one side, Democrats run on another. The top vote getter comes out of it, and then those two people advance to the general election. What that is doing today is pushing both sides to, because the turnout in primaries is so small, the number of voters who are turning out tends to be extreme. The type of voter, who turns out is much more extreme. So the Republican primary voters are very conservative right. The Democratic primary voters are very conservative left, or very liberal left. And so I would love to eliminate partisan primaries and have people run all together. There are multiple ways to do it. Louisiana does what's called a jungle primary, where everybody runs together. California has what's called a top two, meaning, again, everybody runs together, and then the top two people move on to a runoff, but really that's the general election. So the primary is everybody at once. And so in Democratic districts, you get two Democrats at the top. So if you're in South Central LA, you're only getting two Democrats. But in most districts that are normal, you're getting a Democrat and a Republican. And the hope is by having everybody run at once, you don't necessarily have the most extreme person win, because you have to build a larger coalition than just the leftiest or rightiest voters. I don't know that it would work, but I'm willing to try. And I, like Kendall, I am a centrist Democrat. I have always been a centrist Democrat. There's another crazy idea right now that a client of mine is pushing, that really is a weird idea, which is to legalize fusion voting. Fusion voting exists only in New York and Connecticut. Fusion is this weird thing where, so in New York, you can run as a Democrat, but you can also run as an independent, or Independence is actually the party name in New York. You can run on the working families line. You can run on the liberal line. And if all of those lines endorse you, you get to add up all the votes. Fusion used to be the way of the land. I mean, I'm sure Kendall can tell us about Lafayette in Wisconsin there was fusion, right? So fusion used to be a thing where you could do it. Now it's illegal in most states because the law is you can only be on the ballot one time. And so the rationale is, if you did fusion voting, that there could be a centrist Republican party, let's call it the Lincoln Republicans, and they could endorse the Democrat instead of endorsing the Trumpy Republican, that they could try to create a situation where they are actually cross-endorsing a Democrat to create power, and try to minimize the sort of Trump wing. again, I don't know if it works, but at least it's interesting. It's something to, I don't think it's going to happen, but it's an interesting theory.
If I could just interrupt for a second.
Please.
It's La Follette. I thought I'd caught you better, Jeffrey.
La Follette, excuse me.
And 1896 presidential election, there actually was this. And of course, it was a mess.
It blew up.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, thank you.
So Jeffrey, I have a question.
Yes, Sally.
So was when you're talking about the Pennsylvania map, you're talking about the congressional map as opposed to the state house map?
Both. The state house map is even more grotesque than the congressional.
The state house, yeah, the state house map is pretty grotesque, but I thought the Pennsylvania congressional map was redone. And in fact, there is a fellow GA alum who was involved with that.
You're correct.
And I thought it was redone and it made our delegation 9 and 9. Now we've lost a seat, I think.
We've lost a seat. Yes, it did. The congressional map got redrawn because of the courts, but the only reason, that happened. So yes, that's true. But let's talk about why that happened. Is that the Democrats won the state Supreme Court races, and the Democrats were in charge. Otherwise, we'd be in the exact same situation. But it is the state house map that I was referring to that's grotesque.
Okay, I just wanted to clarity on that one. The other question I have is, you said that pollsters have to do what they have to do. Does that mean that they take on any candidate, no matter how grotesque they are? I mean, there are a few candidates who are out there just spouting complete and utter nonsense that, isn't historically accurate. They have zero knowledge really of the Constitution. They're saying things that make zero sense, probably for shock value. Is there no sense of, I don't know, decency or morals, or is it all about chasing a buck in your business?
Have you no decency?
Yes.
Well, Sally, the answer, I mean, I can't imagine why you're talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene in such a way. For example,
I was actually thinking Madison Cawthorn.
They're the same. They're the same, just different gender. Same thing. They're just different gender. There are plenty of Republican pollsters who agree with those folks. Like there are very, very ultra conservative folks, and they work for them. I wouldn't work for those people.
Got it. Okay.
I also wouldn't work for AOC. So like just me. Every pollster has their things that they will or will not do. But that's a business decision. So there are people I won't work for various reasons, or my firm won't work for. We make that decision and how we work for folks. As I said, I'm willing to work for conservative Democrats and progressive Democrats, because I think I couldn't get Joe Manchin elected in New York, and I couldn't get Kirsten Gillibrand elected in West Virginia. So they both represent their states very, very well. And it's my job to be neutral. My job is to get them elected in their state. But there are plenty of Republican pollsters who won't work for the Boeberts and and the Cawthorns and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes as well.
And one more question: why don't you guys just go to Trump rallies to talk to the Trump voter, or is that skewing too much?
So we can't. Have you ever been to a Trump rally?
No, I have not.
Right. Well, ask the media who try to cover a Trump rally, who are crapped on, like almost quite literally, by folks. And it's an untenable, unsafe conversation. Also, they don't want to engage in a conversation when they're at a rally. Again, it's not me being judgmental. They're at a rally. They want to yell about Donald Trump and be passionate. They don't want to have a conversation with me because I'm an untrustworthy source. Good questions.
All right.
I have one.
Go ahead, please.
Thanks so much for your talk. One question I had is, whenever we have big national elections, we hear a lot about undecided voters. And, a lot of us have grown up in areas where the undecided voter seems to be more of a myth than a reality. But can you talk about kind of to what extent there are undecided voters anymore, given the polarization of our political landscape right now?
Yeah, there are undecided voters. There is a reason why in Virginia, Terry McAuliffe was winning by 5, 6, 7, 8 points as of a month ago, and now the race is tied. And so that is about, there is a segment of the electorate that listens, pays attention, and tries to figure out where they're going to go. It's just a smaller portion of the electorate than ever before. So when I was starting in this business in the 90s, the undecided vote was 15, 18, 20%. We're now down to 4, 6, 8% of the vote that's undecided. But they're real. They're very real, and they are watching. Right now, if we didn't have any undecideds, Joe Biden's job approval rating would never change. It would just be the exact same thing for 4 years, and it hasn't. It's gone down. And so people do pay attention and people shift. It's just 90-ish% of us know our partisan corners and are not moving.
Thanks. So as someone who actually lives in Virginia, so who should I be knocking on the doors of to get out to vote in 13 days? Because what you're saying is terrifying.
Well, you should call the McAuliffe campaign, or call. I actually work for Mark Herring, the Attorney General, and I'm worried about his race, and I'm worried about the LG's race. I'm also worried about the State House and those races. So I don't know exactly who, but if you call down to McAuliffe headquarters, I promise you they'll tell you how to help.
Thanks.
Thank you, Emily.
Jeff.
Yes, Mr. House.
No, it's got to be Richard after all these years. You mentioned gerrymandering, partisan primaries. You did not mention the filibuster. What are your thoughts about ending the filibuster at this point?
So I'm very nervous about the filibuster and eliminating the filibuster. I think that there are things that the filibuster has prevented bad things from happening in other times. That doesn't make me a lot of friends on the progressive left who are all for just killing the filibuster and jamming stuff through. But I am worried about the unintended consequences of doing that. And it's where I think Senator Manchin is partially right. I also think he's partially wrong. There are things that I think we probably need to break the filibuster for, such as voting rights, as I mentioned earlier, because if we can't get people to vote to do that, the way that some of these states are talking about changing voting rules, it's crazy and unfair, and fundamentally unfair, just because they are worried about losing elections. And that's just, let's just play this thing fair. So I'm much more, but I also think, like, whether it's abortion or civil rights or any number of other things, that the filibuster has been an important tool. If you actually look, the pro-choice community, the Planned Parenthoods of this world, are on the progressive side, have not weighed in on breaking the filibuster, because they actually are nervous that if you didn't have the filibuster, that would be a way to eliminate abortion rights. And so I think it is not as simple as the some of the progressive left believes, to just eliminate it. I do think we need to change a bunch of things. I think we need to change, we probably need term limits for Supreme Court justices, for example. We can have a system. What is amazing, and Mitch McConnell is a brilliant man, but what he did with the Supreme Court in terms of like how he is willing to have rules when he's in charge and then change those rules when the Democrats are in charge, that is remarkable, and remarkable that he doesn't get called on the carpet for that. But Schumer's got to do the same thing then. And that creates a race to the bottom. And again, these are all things that I worry about.
Can the filibuster be eliminated for some things without being eliminated for everything?
Yes, there would be ways to sort of special rules, special breaking of the filibuster. There are probably ways to do it. Manchin, though, Manchin and Sinema are both dead set against changing the filibuster in any real way.
Thank you.
What is with Kristen Sinema these days?
She's,
what is she really trying to lobby for Arizona?
I don't know is the answer. She's an enigma. She's harder for me to figure out. Joe Manchin's like very clear in who he is, and I'm not sure I understand her politics. I don't she's not my client. I worked, I helped her get elected, but didn't work on the campaign. I worked independently of the campaign. She's always been a little bit of an iconoclast, but this person who's gone from a Green Party anti-war activist to where we are today is a remarkable turnaround. I don't know. She certainly thinks she's representing Arizona's interests. She does.
If you
Yeah, Jeff, I got to pop in here because you
Yes,
brought up one of my favorite people, Mitch. So one of my questions,
the turtle.
he kind of looks like General Meade, but only Civil War people will know who General Meade was. You often hear in the media that the Republicans are more ruthless than Democrats.
Correct.
Like how McConnell has run the Senate in dealing with debt limits, judgeships, et cetera. Do you agree?
Oh, 100%.
And that's the easy thing. Why? Why can't the Democrats be like that?
Because the Democrats were too busy navel gazing and worrying about how people feel. We worry about feelings a lot. Mitch McConnell does not have feelings, and it's why he's an amazing legislative leader. The best legislative leaders all over the country. Let's take the home state. Why was Vince Fumo an amazing leader in the Pennsylvania Senate? Put the criminal stuff aside just for a second, just for a second. But why was he a great leader? Because he took the bullets for everybody. And it's the same legislative leaders who are willing to just like say no and take the bullets for everybody and not care. They're the best ones. And unfortunately, Senator Schumer cares. And so there are also things that are being done. Joe Biden has one ambassador at this point, one. Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley have held up every single ambassador other than one. That is remarkable. And again, where are the norms? Where are the people to stand up and say, hey, this is unfair? We need to move these things forward. So I don't know what Chuck is going to do, but he needs to. The one thing, Kendall, that Chuck and others did understand, the judgeships actually have moved. It's the one thing the Democrats have been pushing through because McConnell was so good at it and the imbalance was so large that they've been working on it from almost from day one of when Biden and they took over the Senate.
Thanks, Jeff.
Are you able to talk about the 2022 Senate race in Pennsylvania?
I
on
am,
the Democratic side?
I work for Arkush, so I'm biased.
Okay.
But it's going to be a tough race. I mean, both the Senate race and the governor's race. I also work for Josh Shapiro. Josh and I grew up very close to each other. He lives 2 blocks from my mother today. We essentially are the same nice Jewish boy, split up. He wanted to run for office. I wanted to do his campaign. So I think both of those are going to be very hard races. I think the governor's race is way harder than people understand.
Oh, yeah.
A Democrat hasn't been, well, forget about a Democrat. The same party doesn't normally win after having 8 years. It was 1950 was the last time a Democrat won election after 8 years of another Democrat. And the electorate is very cranky. So the chance Josh has, I think the Republican primary is, again, Greg, what you asked me before, the Republican primary is pushing to have the Trumpiest, the most extreme folks. And that's an opportunity for Josh, who is very mainstream, very moderate, and is lucky he doesn't have a primary because he is so moderate. On the Senate side, it's hard for me to predict. Fetterman has great name ID, obviously a little too progressive for my taste in terms of winning the race. You got Connor Lamb, who is, of course, as moderate as they come. You have Kenyatta from Philadelphia. So there's a lot of dynamics going on. Hard for me to predict, but Fetterman's got the lead right now. He's got the money, he's got name ID, and so somebody's going to have to take him down to win.
And he also has a great dog on Twitter.
Who? Fetterman does, yeah.
Fetterman, Levi Fetterman.
Yeah.
I think his wife's running the Twitter feed, but it's super entertaining.
Yeah. So we'll see. I don't know.
So an implication of what you just said is that you're expecting a lot of split ticket voting in Pennsylvania?
Not. I'm not. There is
Well,
no.
if you think the governor's race is going to be a lot harder than the Senate race.
No. I think they're both going to be. I think they're both going to be very hard. No. Now Josh Shapiro he got more votes than anybody, including Joe Biden last time. Josh he does better in Pittsburgh than the average Democrat does. And his work on the Catholic Church scandal got him a lot of sort of recognition. And so it is possible that I think Josh could get more votes, but split ticketing, Matt, isn't happening in general. So I think both races are very hard, period.
Jeff, I just had a question. It's Barbara Searle.
Yes.
Do you see any way of using polls to carve out messaging that would lead us to solidify the norms and move us off of square 28, whatever it is, with this partisanship? Is there any way that can be an influence to the nation?
I am not optimistic about that, Barbara. I think that, like I said, on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, there's no incentive for people to go towards the middle because they're trying to protect their right flank or their left flank. So their political incentives right now are they're corrupted is the wrong word, but their motivation is not there to move to the middle. The motivation is to protect even Senator Schumer, who has to worry about whether or not AOC is going to run against him in a primary. And so he's doing more left things than he would normally do. It's not who he is. And yet he is. So until that incentive to move to the partisan right and left stops, I don't know what we can do to drive people to the middle other than try to elect people in the middle. The Problem Solvers Caucus in DC is one way that they're trying. So there are these Republican and Democratic members in the House who get together and try to come together on legislation. So it's Brian Fitzpatrick in Bucks County, for example, along with Josh Gottheimer in New Jersey, and lots of others. But that's the Democratic head and the Republican head. So they're trying. I like that kind of stuff. I think we need more of it. But the incentives are to move left and right, Barbara.
Do you think after 2022, that'll be better or worse?
Worse. Worse. That's where Kendall and I have a disconnect. He's got hope. I'm not feeling that hopeful right now.
I'm not hopeful for 22. I am for 24.
24?
22 is done.
22 is done.
Yeah.
Do you think Al Franken's going to run for anything again?
I think that it is possible that he will run for the United States Senate in New York. And I hope that Senator Gillibrand whops him.
Carpetbagger.
Well, he lives on the Upper West Side now, but
does he?
And he spent plenty of time. I'm a New Yorker now, so yes, he was outside of Zabar's a couple of weeks ago. I saw him. I don't know that to be the case, but he obviously holds great animosity towards Senator Gillibrand, who I believe did the right thing and is not singularly responsible for Al Franken leaving, though that's what he thinks. So he's still active. I get emails from time to time from his super PAC where he's trying to stay involved. So we'll see.
Jeff, we have a question in the chat room.
Sure.
Do you foresee a third or maybe fourth party gaining traction covering the middle?
No. The new party, it's very hard for a new party these days, given the various restrictions that exist in states in order to get on the ballot. And so the wholesale creation of something new, I think, is unlikely. That's why this sort of weird fusion idea, I think, is an offbeat way to potentially try to create something interesting for the center left and center right, potentially. But do I think there's a third or fourth party on the way? No. The only way it happens is if Donald Trump doesn't win the Republican nomination and he decides to break off and create a Trump party, that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to see that happen. All right, we have time for two more questions.
I have a More quick question. To what extent have you done any polling to see how the president's decision on Afghanistan may not have resonated with voters? Now, obviously, it was a big talking point.
I lost you, Emily. Come back.
Sorry. Obviously, it was a huge talking point that the Afghanistan withdrawal was a huge disaster for the president, and it was going to spell the end of his, presidency, et cetera, et cetera. But to what extent do these foreign policy issues actually have an impact on voter behavior when we get to the real elections that are oftentimes years away?
So the answer is there is no question that Afghanistan did have an impact on Biden's rating in a way that foreign policy stuff doesn't normally. Separate answer to your question. Do I think that Afghanistan is going to be relevant come November of 2022? No. But it did have an impact on his ratings. The polling was very clear when we looked at why and what was moving. It was how he's handling COVID, where the numbers have gone down, and how he handled Afghanistan. Those are the reasons why his job approval has weakened. But I just don't think that it's going to be relevant in a year from now. A year from now, it's going to be how has he handled COVID, and as the economy moving in the right direction? That's what's critical. On the Democratic side, also, it's have the Democrats been able to pass some of these pieces of legislation that they think are important to fixing the country. Because if they can't point to accomplishments, then what the hell was the good of having you guys control government?
It just
Any new person have a question?
There was one in the chat about the from Mark Logan, who I don't think, Mr. Logan, I don't think asked a question about the Jersey Gov race, right? So I think the Jersey Gov race is not interesting. I think it is largely over. That's not, I'm not being insulting. I think that Governor Murphy is going to win relatively easily. There has not been the same kind of enthusiasm, the sort of change electorate in New Jersey that there has been in Virginia. I'm not really sure, Mark, why that is. But I think Governor Murphy is going to win relatively easily.
Can I ask one more?
One more. Oh, Beth, yes, finally.
Go ahead, Beth.
Beth works in Washington.
I should probably disclose I work for James Clyburn on the Select Subcommittee for the Coronavirus Crisis, but
Nice.
You mentioned handling of COVID as a key issue for 2022.
Yep.
What messaging strategies do you think are helpful for Dems to reach independents and moderates on COVID specifically?
So it has to be about getting people vaccinated and getting people back to work, because the people who don't take the vaccine, don't believe in the vaccine, won't take the vaccine, are never voting for the Democrats outside of a small group of non-white voters, particularly Black, who have deep-seated mistrust of vaccines for obvious reasons, Beth, that we all know. But outside of that, that's what we have to talk about. We have to talk about delivering shots in arms, getting people back to work, hopefully getting the country back to some sort of normalcy. The big problem is that Joe Biden promised us we were getting back to normal in July, and then, oops, we weren't. And that was a problem. I think as hopefully things open up and things get better and 70% of America is vaccinated, et cetera, that's the way that we get to talk about sort of doing the right thing. Mask mandates, vaccine mandates, all these things, I'm for all of them. And I'm talking about politically. I'm not talking about policy-wise. Politically, I think those are all relatively safe places for a Democrat to be. Because again, the sort of moderate Republican, moderate independent agrees with the Democrats on it. And so those are the things that I think we talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Jeffrey, this has
Kendall.
been marvelous. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I hope that everyone else was as fascinated and interested as I was. And you delivered. I knew you would. You always have, even all the way back to when you were a sophomore in AP European history, which was a very long time ago. So thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Dr. Drew, yes.
Kendall, you failed to mention the highest point of Jeff's career at Germantown Academy, though it was alluded to by Ginny Hoffman.
Indeed.
And that is acting as Tevye in my final production at GA
Indeed.
of Fiddler on the Roof. If
And
I were a rich man.
I had the easiest role model because all I had to do was dress up and look like you. It was easy.
Very good. Thank you, Peter, for reminding me that. It was a slip up.
Thank you, Jeff. It was wonderful.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Terrific.
Now, before we all go, a couple things. One is I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone here that next week is annual giving week. And it's a wonderful time to say thank you in a way that Germantown Academy needs. And those monies go towards helping to fund things like this. Not that I get anything, but just all the extra work that goes into all the alumni activities and all that. Actually, all this is free of charge. And again, I shout out to Heather because she does this because she does it and not because it's part of her job. It's not at all. I keep worrying that she's going to cut the cord on this and I won't be able to do this anymore. But we will be sending out some feedback. We want to hear from you guys. We want to know what worked here, what didn't work. So there'll be some questions and you can write in things as well. We want to know.
We need you to talk to us, unlike those voters that won't talk to Jeff.
We want to know how we can be better. And I will certainly listen, and I know Heather will too. So please give us some feedback. I'm not looking for pats on the back. I just want to know what you want other than topics, because there's a rumor that the next topic is going to be the old guys get back together, and Peter Druniani and myself will be teaching Dickens England and promoting Oliver Twist for those who want to read and go along with it. That should happen probably in late winter, early spring.
How do you guys get to be the old guys?
Because we are.
Yeah. I think some of us are older.
There's a couple of you who are, but for the most part, no. But hey, we're all the same, right? Doesn't matter.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you want to be the oldest, my hat's off to you. So I don't think I'm that old until I look in the mirror. So without further ado, Heather, did I cover everything? I did? Okay. I want to thank you all. I've enjoyed the last 5 weeks. I get a kick out of this. It's what I did for 43 years, particularly at Germantown Academy. I am grateful every day for the time I had at GA. I miss it. I miss teaching, and now I'm back doing it again without grading papers and listening to angry parents. So, hey, this is the best of all possible worlds, because if I don't like you, I can just mute you. Just teasing. So
I did that for years.
So
thank you, Kendall, for all your work. We really all appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks,
Stay
big guy.
tuned.
Thank you,
God
Kendall.
bless.
Thank you, Kendall. It was awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks,
And
Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank
Peter
you.
and I will be back again later on. So good night, everybody. I owe some emails to a couple of you. You know who you are. I will get to you, just not tonight. So thanks for tuning in. Take care. And if anybody has questions for Jeff, pass them to me and I'll get them to him and I can get you answers. So thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this, both
Thanks,
of you.
Kendall.
Take care.
Right.
Bye.
Talk to you soon.
Will do.